In 1983, a neuroscientist at the University of California asked volunteers to do something simple. Flex your wrist. Whenever you feel like it, no rush. Just whenever the urge comes, move. That was the entire experiment. Benjamin Libet sat behind his equipment and watched, and what he found in that simple, almost boring instruction destroyed one of the most fundamental assumptions human beings make about themselves. The volunteers felt the urge to move. They moved. They reported exactly when the urge had arrived. Clean, simple, personal. The decision was theirs. Except the data said something different. Libet's equipment was recording their brain activity in real time, and the brain had already started preparing the movement, measurably, detectably, up to 550 milliseconds before the volunteers reported feeling any urge at all. The decision to move had begun in the brain before the person was aware of deciding anything. You did not decide to move your wrist. Your brain decided, and then, a third of a second later, it told you. The finding was so uncomfortable that the scientific community spent the following decade looking for a way out of it. Maybe the volunteers were misreporting when the urge arrived. Maybe the clock they were watching introduced measurement error. Maybe the readiness potential, the brain signal Libet had detected, wasn't actually a decision, just a preparation, a kind of neural clearing of the throat before the real choice was made. Each objection was tested, some held partially, none eliminated the core finding. In 2008, neuroscientists John Dylan Haynes and Chun Seong-soon at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin ran a version of Libet's experiment using fMRI, a technology Libet hadn't had access to, which could image the entire brain rather than just the motor cortex. Participants sat inside a scanner and pressed one of two buttons whenever they felt like it, using either their left or right hand. They reported the moment they became aware of the intention to press. The results were worse than Libet's. Haynes and Soon could predict which button a participant would press, left or right, up to 10 seconds before the participant reported any conscious intention to press anything. 10 seconds. The brain had already made the choice. The person hadn't felt it yet. They were, in the most literal measurable sense, the last to know. The region that gave the prediction away was the frontopolar cortex, an area associated with planning and intention. It was quietly encoding the future decision long before consciousness had any access to it. What the person experienced as the moment of choosing was not the beginning of the decision. It was the moment the brain's conclusion was finally handed upward into awareness. But here is where it gets more complicated and more interesting. Libet himself did not conclude that free will was an illusion. He was careful about this in ways that most summaries of his work skip entirely. What he found was that while the brain initiated movement before conscious awareness, participants could still consciously veto the movement in the final 200 milliseconds before it happened. The urge would arrive. The preparation would begin. And then, occasionally, participants would suppress it, decide not to move, at the last moment. This veto was not preceded by the same readiness potential. It appeared to originate differently. Libet proposed that free will might not be the freedom to initiate actions. It might be the freedom to stop them, not the author of what begins, but the editor of what completes. This is a smaller freedom than the one most people assume they have, but it is not nothing. The neuroscientist Patrick Haggard at University College London has spent the last 2 decades refining this picture. His work has consistently shown that the experience of agency, the feeling that you are the one causing your actions, is itself a construction. In a series of experiments, Haggard demonstrated that the brain systematically compresses the perceived time between an action and its consequence, making the two feel closer together than they actually are. This compression is what generates the feeling of having caused something. The brain is not reporting causality accurately. It is manufacturing the sensation of authorship. In one particularly striking experiment, Haggard used transcranial magnetic stimulation, a technique that triggers muscle movements by passing a magnetic field through the skull, to cause participants' fingers to move involuntarily. When asked whether they had chosen to move, participants frequently said yes. The movement had been externally caused. The brain had generated the feeling of intention anyway, retroactively, because a movement had occurred and the brain expected to have caused it. The feeling of deciding is not evidence that you decided. This finding has traveled far beyond the laboratory. Legal systems in multiple countries have begun grappling with what neuroscience implies about criminal responsibility. If behavior is generated by brain processes that precede conscious awareness, the traditional framework of moral responsibility. You knew what you were doing and you chose to do it, becomes philosophically complicated in ways that courts are not yet equipped to handle. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has argued for decades that this is the wrong way to frame the problem. Dennett's position is that the self is not something separate from the brain that could in principle override it. The self is the brain. The processes that generate behavior are not happening to you, they are you, operating at a level below the resolution of conscious experience. Free will, in this view, is real, but it is not what people think it is. It is not a ghost in the machine making choices independent of biology. It is the machine, the entire integrated system of brain and body, doing what it does. But the machine does not experience itself as a machine. It experiences itself as a person making choices. And that experience is so consistent, so convincing, so present in every waking moment, that dismantling it even theoretically produces something close to vertigo. You are reading these words right now, and something in you is reacting, agreeing, disagreeing, feeling unsettled or relieved or skeptical. That reaction feels like yours. It feels chosen. It arrived without announcement from processes you have no access to in a brain that had already moved before you knew you were moving. The Libet experiment has been replicated, challenged, refined, and debated for 40 years. The core finding has not been overturned. What has changed is the interpretation, the question of what it actually means for how we understand ourselves. What it does not mean is that nothing matters, that choices are irrelevant, that responsibility dissolves. The veto is real. The editor exists. The gap between impulse and action, however narrow, is where something that functions like choice actually lives. But the director's chair you thought you were sitting in has been empty for a long time. The decisions arrive. You experience them as yours. And somewhere below the level you can reach, something that is also you already knew what you were going to do.